sisters and brothers. Even though it's a smaller night today because we have so many comrades outside doing much of the important work that we need, as Antonio was saying, for the elections, it is also hard not to be excited about this topic because it's something that actually a lot of us don't even know because it's just so controlled, and we always complain of the media blackout, but we'll see just to what extent that blackout has failed to cover this movement. You know, sometimes the people I'm talking about, their drive to change the world is taunted as naive idealism because the young have yet to recognize the supposed limits of the real world. Other times their tactics and organizations are criticized for not reflecting the maturity or pragmatism that comes from seasoned veterans of the movement. But whatever critique the establishment may have of students, what it cannot afford to ignore is the fact that when young people everywhere begin to stand up against the system they question and start to fight back, that is when the establishment actually shivers at its core. Capitalist governments throughout the world, from pre-revolutionary Cuba to Nicaragua, from France to El Salvador, from Chile to here in the US, have felt the wrath of students and young people when they took to the streets, shut down schools, organized revolutionary institutions, and in some cases helped topple dictatorships. Sometimes the role of students goes unnoticed in history books. And in recent times, it is not that different. As I was saying, just this blackout, you would never know what's happening in the following three countries. Here in the heart of world imperialism, we often complain that the media blackout the U.S. population faces, but in the past few months, that blackout has even been more pronounced when it comes to these massive student movements in Chile, Quebec, and Mexico. These movements have not only drawn tens of thousands of students, but they've also drawn thousands of workers who identify with the students' demands and sentiments. Each of these movements could actually have a whole talk dedicated to them, but what we're going to do tonight is just simply go over their impact, and also how they relate to one another, because that's actually really important. For the last few months, Mexico has been saturated by electoral politics. If people know the election's actually going to happen in a week. While many remember the stolen elections of 2006, which led to a year-long occupation of Mexico City's main plaza, El Zócalo, it seemed like many didn't remember that prior to the dismal reign of the PAN, which is the Partido Acción Nacional, it was decades of dominance of the corrupt party PRI, which is known as the Revolution Institution Party, that passed many of the neoliberal policies which haunt Mexico today. Up until a month ago, thanks to a massive media campaign directed specifically by the ruling class, and more information has actually come out as to just how much the Mexican ruling class has collaborated with Televisa, which is the national one of the largest television stations, not only in Mexico, but throughout all Latin America. Prior to this, the PRI presidential candidate, Enrique Peña Nieto, was set to win next week's elections, hands down. The PRI sold itself as being the party that brought prosperity to Mexico's national industries and maintained stability in the country since it formed after the revolution. Due to the thousands of drug trade-related deaths, the fall of the Mexican economy, the rise in poverty and immigration, the vast majority of the population was just fed up with the current PAN. Actually, I went to a protest where they said, no queremos pan, queremos más tortilla. And so, if you forget that, it's like we don't want bread, but it's a combination of we don't want pan. And while most of the social movements supported the center-left candidate, the PRD candidate, Partido Revolucionario Demócrata, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he faced too many hurdles to get his campaign off the ground. All that changed on May 11th, when the students at a well-known university in Mexico kicked the PRI candidate, Nieto, off the campus, and how we say, a gritos, like yelling at him. Nieto had scheduled a forum on the campus, but had made the students upset by filling more than half the seats with supporters from outside the campus, arrogantly justifying the brutal repression in 2006 of campesino protesters in the city of Atenco, and ignoring the direct questions made by students regarding the state of Mexican society. And even prior to that, they have criticized the candidate because of his, they say, pretty boy looks. And so once you actually talk to him, like, had no way to answer and just did things in generalities. And young people were pretty upset. Nieto allegedly hid in a bathroom, and at one point is caught on camera visibly nervous about his safety. He eventually escaped with the help of his security, with students celebrating his retreat. The PRI tried to suppress this embarrassing situation by claiming that the students were outside agitators, and gave Nieto ample time to dismiss the protests on the national television station Televisa. But they couldn't foresee what would happen next. The video of the protest went viral. The video, then 131 students, because Peña Nieto emphasized that these were outside agitators, that it wasn't the sentiment, that he was willing to discuss and debate with the students as much as they wanted, but that he wouldn't do it in like an undemocratic way and not as equals. Well, 131 students who were at the protest posted a video online showing their ID cards, their university ID cards, and calling for a massive march on May 18th. This movement eventually became known as Yo Soy 132, and it's actually the hashtag for the Twitter that they've been using. And the reason they use that is to allow for the support and addition of others to the movement, because it was 131 students that faced off this corrupt, inept face of the state, and so you could be the 132nd. So it was like Yo Soy 132, and it was everybody coming together in that. The movement quickly stood in solidarity with other working class struggles in Mexico. And a statement made by the first student assembly of various universities shows just how Yo Soy 132, the movement, knows its history and roots of struggle. And they went on to say in this release, they pointed out to years, since like the 1930s, years and years of corruption in the Mexican state. Actually after the nationalization, after Cárdenas. But they just point to the electoral fraud in 1988, in 2006. They point to the economic crisis that hit Mexico in 1982, 1994, and in 2008. They talk about the movements, the student movements that were brutally crushed in the 60s, the uprising of insurgent movements in the 70s. And they point to the creation of autonomous universities, which is a concept actually that's very unique to Latin America. The US hasn't. The students haven't yet, I think, tied to that. But in Latin America, it's really the U.S. are independent institutions that the police do not step foot on, security forces do not step foot on, it's student organizations. And what they finally said after saying, we remember all these things, they said, all this history is claimed and remembered by us. Today, being 132 means being history. Thanks to the movement, the political landscape in Mexico has changed dramatically. Every day, Nieto and the PRI are witnessing falling ratings. They're being exposed by more and more media for corrupt practices. And while the movement claims to be nonpartisan, many have shown ample support for Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is quickly catching up to the Nieto's campaign. The Yo Soy 132 movement is still developing, and its demands are still very liberal, such as an end to corruption, a democratic Mexico, an end to impunity, and more access to media. But the movement has allowed for a much-needed progressive space to protest an environment of brutal repression by both the corrupt Mexican state and the narco state. And it's been a long time coming. There had been a peace caravan. We were always, there's so much happening in the world, especially Latin America. But in Mexico in particular, it was death after death. We were talking about in May it was like 47 deaths. In April it was like 50 deaths. So something, it's horrendous what's happening in Syria. It's horrendous what's happening in the rest of the world. But this is a regular occurrence in Mexico in the backyard, and nothing ever gets said. And you couldn't say anything because if you did, you're a journalist that woke up dead. And so they tried to do a peace caravan, but the peace caravan was particular to the drug trade. So suddenly this pops open. And it's just the strength that students have in actually opening up that and changing the dynamic. Another important student movement that shook the state apparatus, but was less about bourgeois elections and more about the rising cost of education, is the Quebec student strike. This strike was also largely ignored by the US media, probably because the cuts and hikes faced by students in Quebec are similar, if not worse, for the students here in the US. The strike that began in February as a response to plans from 2010 to raise tuition by over 75% is the result of months of organizing by student unions. The government claims that the plans to raise the tuition fee is to be implemented in order for universities, quote, to improve their competitive positioning worldwide and to stand out in strategic areas. The goal of making universities, quote, competitive institutions is an attempt to make universities market-based institutions to produce additional profits for the super rich. The attempt to profit from the education process itself is highlighted by the government's proposal to allocate some of the revenue from the hike to offer loans to students who are unable to pay for the hikes at all. So again, taking money from us to pay those who have less. But obviously, we don't have enough either. At first, student groups attempt to negotiate with the government of Quebec with petitions, letters, calls to government officials to persuade them to increase fees. When those methods fail, groups like the Coalition of the Association for Student Unity Solidarity, CLASE, called for a student strike to escalate the movement. And it's a very interesting part there in Quebec because while the region is a large region, it's encompassing different groups, there's a large French population as well that is often faced a lot of oppression from the Canadian government. So it's a very unique struggle in Canada. And the ongoing student strike that began in mid-February has had an enormous impact in Quebec so far, including a demonstration on May 22nd. And if people saw the photos, it was between 300 and 400,000 people. In response to the strike, the Liberal Party of Jean Charest has implemented a law known as Bill 78. And this law requires prior approval for any demonstration of over 50 people, sounds familiar, imposes large fines for violations, and makes supporting the strike illegal. This new law was met with more protests, but this time from the larger Quebec and Canadian working class, who were shocked at the reaction by the state to suppress a peaceful but well-organized movement. The strike still continues to draw thousands, and yesterday it entered its 130th day. And you wouldn't know that unless you were following things. It's just finally, and this is the third large student movement. Definitely, these aren't the only three, but they're examples, and they vary very much in terms of the conditions that they're stemming from, what they're actually going against. But this third one is also one that it's amazing that it's been almost a year. There is the Chilean student movement and strikes which have called for a national strike this upcoming June 28th in order to commemorate their 1 year of struggle against the right-wing attack on the public university system. While this is the last example of this talk, it is the one with the most importance in terms of understanding the strength of internal organization and international solidarity. For over a year, the Chilean student movement, which comprises of several organizations, something that I think is interesting, I tried to find a similar example here in the US. I don't know if Canada had a similar thing. I don't think Mexico has anything similar. But it says the organizations include the Federation of Chilean University Students, the Coordinating Assembly of Students, the National Coordinator of Middle School Students, they actually are the most militant, and the larger umbrella group of the Confederation of Chilean Students. And thanks to these different groupings that have actually managed to work together, they've been able to maintain regular protests with attendance of tens of thousands on a regular basis, along with enormous support of labor unions, teacher unions, and social movements. Chile has, quote, one of the lowest levels of public funding for their higher education, some of the most time-consuming degrees, and no comprehensive system of student grants or subsidized loans, end quote, according to The Economist, which isn't, a progressive magazine. It also has the most expensive educational system in the world, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is further highlighted by the fact that the country has the most right-wing president since the fall of dictator Augusto Pinochet. The government of Sebastián Piñera has continuously ignored the demands of the students and has regularly used tear gas canisters, water cannons, and riot cops to crush the movement. And while like here, people remember Occupy, it was like a big thing with one big session, which was important to the struggle here. In Chile, if you just look and turn on, it's like every protest is just mad, it's brutal repression, and yet the students and families, they're out there in the streets. Well, much of the strength of the movement comes from its capacity to mobilize students in the streets. They are known for their effective use of diverse tactics in order to get their message across. From occupations of schools and universities, to flash mobs, to street theater, to sit-downs, to negotiations, to massive national strikes, the movement's ability to continuously motivate the grassroots is its greatest strength. And this diversity of tactics stems from its highly developed organizational structure. Some of the main groups are led by communist and socialist forces, such as the case with the Federation of Chilean University Students. Does somebody know who the face of that movement is?
Sure.
No, the Federation in Chile. She's a woman, young woman. That's probably the only image that you've probably seen out of all the media that comes out from Chile.
Is it?
Ah, come on. He's reading the paper. Sorry, I know that. So anyways, yes, it's Camila Vallejo. Camila Vallejo, and she's a militant with the Young Communist League, the youth wing of the Chilean Communist Party. And she's actually been taken, for some reason, The Guardian, which has a vicious anger towards Venezuela, really likes her and has done these really great interviews. You know, some of them, unfortunately, have that angle, because while she's a young militant woman, they point to her attractiveness or whatever, but she's a well-spoken, very militant and prepared person who's really built these coalition with all these different structures. And Camila has been prominent internationally for her dynamic role in presenting the message of Chilean students and tying it to the international movements for social justice and liberation. Recently, Camila participated in a Cuba Youth Forum where she met with Fidel and held the accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution, highlighting the fact that Cuba has free education for all its students. She has shown support and solidarity during marches and events for the Quebec struggles. Just a couple of weeks ago, Camila visited Mexico and spoke at a Yo Soy 132 rally at the Zócalo, in which thousands of people attended. Camila praised the movement, saying, quote, "We salute the Mexican youth because just as the Chilean youth, they have given a hard fight, an example for dignity," end quote. The workers' perspective of the leadership of the Chilean movements has allowed for it to build a strong social movement at home and abroad. This is summarized by Camila herself, this tactic of creating a broader movement, and we've always said that the PSL has always pointed out when we participate in the struggle, it just can't be isolated. Any movement that is isolated will eventually become weak as soon as it is continuously attacked by the state and shown no solidarity to the outside. And she says, quote, "The youth has to gamble in building a broad social movement, transversal and diverse, where there are workers, the people, because it is there that the foundation of society is found, and always from their mobilization, they'll bring radical transformations to the social, political, and economic structure of a country," end quote. Camila is only a leader in the movement, which is comprised of tens of thousands of students, and she admits it's the people in motion that bring real change. But for us, and part of this talk as well, and hopefully we can analyze it a little bit further in the conversation, it's important to analyze the role that the leadership plays in building and organizing a movement. If people know here, the Occupy movement itself was comprised of a lot of students, actually in a lot of campuses. And one of the sentiments in general was this not hostility, but the sort of cautiousness towards the idea of any type of organization. And here we are looking at the Chilean and Latin American struggles where it's like the organization is what gels it together and actually provides for the most diversity of tactics and for the most flexibility. Here in the US, students' movement have not yet formed a large and broad organizations that are independent of the Democratic Party. However, there is a history of student struggle that led to the closure of campuses and hunger strikes. They succeeded in making ethnic studies available, lowering tuition costs, and opening campuses to people of color. The students must build on the collective history of their peers and tie it to the collective history of those who fought and struggled in the country and in the world. Because it's only through building, and as I was saying, and the solidarity needed is that then more people will identify with the needs of students and want to be a part of it and feel a part of it as well. Most importantly, we must organize and participate in the process of revolutionary change that will bring free education for all students at home and abroad.